Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. My name is Jim Byrne. I'm just going to give a few introductory comments, and then we'll be moving on to our session speakers, all of whom will be far more entertaining than I am. But yes, glad to have you here, and of course, this is just kind of an introductory slide. We're announcing today a new initiative with the American Geophysical Union. We're starting a series, an annual series of climate change solutions conferences, and we're looking for people to participate, obviously. We're planning, and we recognize the time frame is tight. The first session will be running, the first conference will be running in the summer of 2018. So this initiative has been evolving very quickly over the last, it feels like hours, but it's been more than that, although the hours have been ticking endlessly as well as we work through this. I'll be introducing some other people in just a few minutes. And this, of course, is a late-breaking session that American Geophysical Union kindly put on to get this initiative started. We didn't really get started on this until the fall and decided we really just need to do this. We have to do this. And it's coming together with a great deal of wonderment and stress because of a lot of people working very hard. So welcome to the session today. Want to introduce some people who have all contributed so far, and their contributions are much appreciated. Most of them are in the room, so if you could just kind of wave your arm when I say your name. Of course, Richard Ali, sitting up front, has been a wonderful contributor and helped and provided some great advice. I'm James Byrne from University of Lethbridge. Richard, of course, from Pennsylvania State, but I think everybody knows that. Irena Creed, my colleague here from University of Saskatchewan, right down in front. Susan Hassel from Climate Communication. Roland Krobel from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Mike Mann from Pennsylvania State. Sarah Myhre from University of Washington is over there. Kent Peacock, University of Lethbridge. My colleague Kent is back in Lethbridge. He's had some fairly serious health problems and couldn't attend, and so we certainly wish him well and a speedy recovery. Stefan Ramstorff, down in front here from Potsdam Institute. Dave Titley from Pennsylvania State University, there he is there. And Yangyang from Texas A&M University. Yangyang is somewhere around here because he's speaking in a little while, so I'm sure he'll be here soon. Okay. Climate change is going to hurt us. It's already hurting us. It's hurting us a lot. You know, I'm just throwing in a few scary slides because we always seem to do this scary thing to tell people that we're having all kinds of trouble. British Columbia is had its worst fire year ever. I think California is having its worst fire year right now as we speak. If we were all in San Francisco, maybe we would be breathing a lot of smoke. And the World Health Organization recently said we're all breathing a lot of smoke. 92% of the global population is adversely affected by air pollution. And I tell my students now, when you're parked at an intersection, roll your window down and take a shallow breath through your nose and smell the air pollution, because that's at intersections we all get a fairly substantial loading of air pollution. So we got to get rid of those fossil fuel cars. And of course, conflict. There's all kinds of climate change conflict related to things going on, and we want to, to change that. So this new initiative, as I already said, wonderful. Please plan to participate. If you have things that you can contribute, if you perhaps want to convene a session, we'd really like to hear from you as soon as possible. The AGU Meetings Department will be working hard on this. They've been wonderful so far. The American Geophysical Union generally has been wonderful, and of course the academics and scientists that run the meetings groups have been very supportive as well. So climate change solutions. These are way more varied than our science. They're way more multidisciplinary than just our science. We need help from all disciplines, and this is a multidisciplinary initiative. Political, economic, social boundaries, climate change solutions don't go across many of those boundaries. We're going to need different solutions for different locations. What will work in Alberta may not work in Texas, may not work in Venezuela, may work in Libya or India or Bangladesh. We definitely have so many, complexities in our societies nowadays that we're going to have to look at complex solutions in many cases. So we're looking to build those multidisciplinary team. The goals, and I should have put a great big bold draft across this because we need your input. the conference committee will be looking for your input on what we should be doing and the directions we should be going. But so far, our goals: build capacity to address climate solutions within and across communities. So that's a pretty straightforward statement. Document solution systems in place or in development for public and private sector application. Education curriculum for schools, colleges, and universities. We're working with AGU publications. We want to work with education specialists, and of course, refereed publications. All of those are part of our goals for this. And so that's as much as you need to hear from Jim Byrne, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Michael Mann right now.
Okay, well, thanks, Jim. So we're going to start off the session with our first speaker, Stefan Rahmstorf, who will be talking about how much CO2 we can still emit while limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. I'm looking forward to this presentation. So without further ado, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, I clicked. Oops. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, especially since this is, I looked it up, my first AGU meeting since 21 years ago, because I tend to limit my flight emissions, and so I don't usually fly to San Francisco, and the AGU is there. My topic is how much CO2 can we still emit whilst fulfilling the Paris Climate Agreement. That's a question that natural scientists can actually answer about solutions. And I will tell you why that is the case. First of all, I started my talk here with the global temperature curve again, because to remind you of the scale of the problem that we have here, we have reached about 1 degree global warming, and Mike will tell you if you really take the word pre-industrial seriously, you'd have to add on probably 0.1, 0.2 degrees still, because this is only since the late 19th century that we have 1 degree warming thus far. Now, luckily, there has been an agreement to stop this warming trend, reached to the day 2 years ago in Paris, in a consensus of 195 nations, a really historic agreement, which is beautiful, except that it comes at least 10 years too late, because now, as I will show, it's become really tough to actually limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So the same Paris Climate Agreement 10, 20 years earlier, I would have been extremely happy, but I was still happy that at least finally this historic agreement was reached at all, which is clearly quite difficult if you have to do it by consensus, and there are a lot of countries who earn their living by selling fossil fuels. So it is actually quite an achievement to have reached this agreement, and it just shows how strong the scientific evidence is that we urgently need to do something, because otherwise, if it wasn't so strong, of course, a lot of countries, I won't name any now, but a lot of countries would have refused to agree to an agreement that will really transform their economy. So if we ask the question how much CO2 we can still emit, then the key point of information is this diagram from the IPCC, which tells you that the warming that we will reach depends on the cumulative emissions. That is a very important point to remember. It doesn't depend on current emissions, but the cumulative emissions, because we are basically filling the atmosphere with CO2 like you would fill a bathtub with water. It all adds up, and that's because of the very long lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The amount that we have already added, incidentally, is already so much that we have a good chance of preventing the next ice age, which by the Milankovitch cycles that cause these ice ages would be due in 50,000 years from now. But there's so much of the CO2 that we have already added will still be hanging around the atmosphere in 50,000 years, that we're now about at the threshold where this would prevent the last ice age. And if we keep emitting for another 50 years or so, it will definitely be above the threshold where it will prevent the next ice age. But that's just as an aside. showing you that CO2 is very long-lived. That's why it depends on cumulative emissions. And so the question is, how much can we still emit while limiting warming to well below 2 degrees? And we published an article which had an analysis on this last year in Nature Climate Change. It's this piece, and it contains this diagram where all the dots here, they are individual model simulations that are in the IPCC scenario database. And on the x-axis, you see the amount of CO2 emitted from 2011 in this case, which was a start year of this consideration. And on the vertical axis, you see the probability of staying below 2 degrees, with that in the red dots and below 1.5 in the blue dots. And you can see a fair amount of spread because the models, the scenarios differ in how many other greenhouse gases, how quickly the other gases other than CO2 are limited, and so on. There's various other factors coming into play, but you can fit a nice smooth curve to this. And the curve for 2 degrees is a red curve, and you can read with these arrows, for example, if you want 2/3 probability of staying below 2 degrees, then you can emit still about 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide from 2011. And if you want a 50-50 chance to stay below 1.5 degrees, you can still emit about 500 gigatons from 2011. So that would argue for a range somewhere between 500 and 1,000 gigatons as being Paris compatible. There have been, and of course, from 2011. So if you now subtract the emissions between 2011 and now, that range reduces already to 250 to 750 gigatons, would be one estimate of the Paris compatible range. There has been a more detailed discussion with the full uncertainties by Glenn Peters in an article where he concluded that the range is between 150 and 1,050 gigatons to be compatible with Paris. In either case, the mean value of that is somewhere around 500 to 600 gigatons CO2. So if we take the mean estimate of our remaining CO2 budget, that's what it is. Now, the current emissions, they are shown here. This is only the fossil ones, and the fossil ones add up to about 37 gigatons this year. You add the deforestation in, then you're already at about 40 gigatons, and that means the 600 gigaton budget that we still have at 40 gigatons per year, the current emissions would last us 15 years. So at the current emissions, the world has 15 years of CO2 emissions left, and then it's over, basically, if we want to stick to the Paris Agreement. That's pretty a striking result, and it just shows we can't stay at the current emission level. We have to get down as soon as we possibly can. And we published an article with Christiana Figueres as a lead author earlier this year in Nature discussing this. The title, 3 Years to Safeguard Our Climate, refers to the fact that at the latest in 2020, in 3 years' time, we have to have reached the global emissions peak. Otherwise, we basically lose the chance to fulfill the Paris Agreement and stay well below 2 degrees. And that diagram is from this article by Figueres and colleagues, and it shows in the solid lines a 600 gigaton emissions budget, but just differently distributed over time with different peak years. Now, if we peaked last year, which last year looked vaguely possible, but now this year the emissions have gone up again, then these emissions, by ramping down in the slope like shown here, would have lasted us till 2045, and then the world would have had to reach zero. If we only peak in 2020, we'll have to reach zero emissions already by the year 2040. And if we wait until 2025, until emissions peak, then we're facing a cliff. That is really why we cannot afford any further delay in starting to reduce global emissions. Otherwise, we don't have a chance to stay well below 2 degrees. I should say this is without considering negative emissions, and there are people that argue, well, we can emit more, but then we draw the CO2 out of the atmosphere again. I will believe that when I see it. I don't think we have really the capacity to do this on a large scale, as some of the, or many of the integrated assessment models claim. If you do the detailed analysis, these models do that by bioenergy with carbon storage. We simply don't have the land area to do that on the scale that would that is assumed in these integrated assessment models. So I think my time is practically up, or? Oh, I still got 6 minutes. Then I'll leave this up for a bit longer so that you can appreciate this diagram more, because it's called the ski slope diagram. And I think Richard Somerville first coined this phrase quite a few years ago, actually, because the blue slope is usually the beginner slope, at least in Europe. And but 10 years ago, that would have been the beginner's slope if we had peaked emissions then. Now it's already quite steep, and the longer we wait, the more impossible it gets. But I want to point out the dashed line as well, just to show you what it looks like if you take a more generous emissions budget of 800 gigaton. If you say, well, we overestimated climate sensitivity, climate is a bit less sensitive than we thought, etc., maybe we can still emit 800 gigatons. That still means we have to reach zero before 2050. So that is how tough the problem is, unless you're a believer in huge amounts of negative emissions. And as I said, I don't think that's realistic. There's another article that I want to point you to by Johan Rockström and colleagues, published in Science also this year. So you see all the top journals, Nature, Science, they have covered this basic issue. And this comes to a similar conclusion. This is the pathway that limits global warming to 2 degrees in the Science article, and it's kind of an idealized curve where they assumed a simple carbon law that is a bit like Moore's law for computational power that kind of doubles every so many years. I don't know what the number is currently. I think it used to double every 18 months or something. But the idea of this carbon law is every decade we halve the global emissions. And that's what the red curve shows here. We start with the current 40 gigatons per year. In one decade, we halve it to 20, the next decade to 10, and then to 5. And in 2050, that doesn't quite get us to zero, but this one assumes CO2 removal in the blue curve, and that means that it is effectively net zero as well. That's a simple law to remember. We have to, every decade, at least halve the global emissions. And so with that, I'm already finished with my presentation. And yeah, thanks for listening. Follow me on social media if you like to do that. And I hope we have some further stimulating thoughts on how we halve the emissions every decade. Thanks.
I believe that's at Ramstorff on Twitter. Okay, questions for Stefan. Alan?
What do you think about stratospheric geoengineering as a solution?
Well, I think that is a kind of desperate measure to contemplate things like that, and we're not entirely desperate yet. I think there would be a lot of side effects and a lot of dangers to geoengineering in this way. First of all, if you only do solar radiation management, which that is, you haven't solved the ocean acidification problem, which alone would be reason enough to reduce our CO2 emissions very rapidly. Secondly, you would, of course, limit the incoming solar radiation, which drives photosynthesis and our food production on the planet, which could have a lot of side effects. There could be big side effects on precipitation patterns, atmospheric circulation patterns. And last not least, one of my main arguments against active geoengineering of climate in this way is that we would commit ourselves to doing this for many thousands of years. As I pointed out, we are preventing the next ice age 50,000 years down the track. Now, if we add a lot of CO2, but at the same time counterbalance it by particles in the stratosphere that reflect solar radiation, if we stop doing this just for a couple of years, those particles will fall out, and within a very short time, all the warming that is embedded in that CO2 would hit us very quickly. And you can only imagine that in 350 years or so, there is some other war on this planet, and we are unable to keep up the geoengineering renewal constantly all the time. And then we are hit by catastrophic warming. I just don't think humanity is smart enough to actively control the climate. I think we should try and keep it a self-regulating system as it has been in the last millennia.
In our book, The Madhouse Effect, our chapter on geoengineering is entitled Geoengineering or What Could Possibly Go Wrong. Our next speaker is David Titley from my home institution of Penn State University, and he will be talking about climate change and risks to national security. David.
That timer works. Okay, good, great, thank you. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thanks very much. So what I'm going to talk about here is, as the talk mentions, it's really the risk to national security. I call it people, not polar bears, and I'm sorry, yes, there was a very emaciated polar bear on the news here in the last couple days, but my personal opinion is we've seen a lot of really sick polar bears, and we haven't really changed much, so I'm not sure that's really going to get us anywhere. The other part I'm going to stress a little bit more in this part of the talk is adaptations. So Jim talked about the need for solutions, and I think we're going to hear a lot about the ultimate fixing the root cause, which is reducing, of course, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. But in the meantime, we are going to have to adapt to the climate change we have already committed to. So, yeah, okay. Well, we need to be 5% smarter than the. Okay, here, just give me the keyboard. Thanks. Okay, great. So the way that climate impacts security really is on these three bullets. In the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about the first two today: changes in the operating environment and bases and training ranges. In question and answer, if we want to talk about how climate can make bad situations worse, and sometimes catastrophically so, I'm happy to address that. But in the interest of time, I'm really just going to talk about the first two bullets here. So one of the places the operating environment is getting changed very rapidly, I would argue faster than any other place on Earth, is the Arctic. And when we, at least in the United States, think about the Arctic, if we think about the Arctic, we tend to think of Alaska. This is the Bering Strait. Those are the Diomede Islands, where if you stand on Little Diomede, you can see Alaska, or you can see Russia from Alaska, just as a point. And that's what we think about. But if we also think about the Arctic, as the ice comes out of here, this is from the US Navy's Task Force Climate Change Roadmap, those lines there, those red, green, and blue lines are potential trade routes that open up, and they are going to potentially, not immediately, but probably when we start seeing seasonal ice-free conditions, start changing the very trade routes of the United States, which is really, of the world, I should say, which is really the economic lifelines of our economy, of the global economy. So it's kind of a big deal. Things I think about, in addition, is this is the flag of Greenland. When we come to AGU and we think of Greenland, we probably think of ice and ice melting and how are the ice fields going to behave. I tend to think of this as an island with 50,000 indigenous people. 50,000, to give you a scale, is about the number of people we have on Penn State's main campus when we're in session. Greenland wants to be independent. How is an independent country of 50,000 in that strategic location going to work? Who are they going to ally with? I can tell you that the Chinese have been very assiduous in cultivating relationships with Greenland. When I talk to our State Department, I'm not quite sure they can find it on a map. So we just sort of assume Greenland is going to be there for us. Well, maybe that's true, maybe that's not. The blue circle is on a place called Svalbard. It may be the most strategic island in the Arctic you have never heard of. Svalbard sits, as you can see, astride those red lines and the green line, so astride sea lines of communication. It is astride a strait that the Russian Navy needs to come out if they want to work in the Atlantic from their Arctic bases there. In addition to that, Svalbard is so far north 80 degrees north, it can actually control every single polar orbiting satellite on every single orbit. So this is not out of Star Wars Episode 2. This is actually part of the infrastructure on Svalbard to control that. So it's an amazingly strategic location. There is a Treaty of Svalbard. It makes it a little less clear as to who really owns Svalbard. Any Norwegians here? If there are Norwegians, they say, oh yes, it's ours, end of story, except it's not quite the end of story. And the Russians know that, and the Russians push on this. So I think there's a reason that just within the last 3 days, the Norwegian Ministry of Defense stated that NATO needs to pay more attention to the maritime domain. And the Arctic is nothing if not a maritime domain. And it will be increasingly contested in the future, and NATO must be prepared. Okay, I'm going to talk about bases and training ranges here for just a little bit. So this is a map of the greater Norfolk area. That's Chesapeake Bay, the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, so that's the Delmarva Peninsula, very tip. And that yellow circle, if you see that, that's actually where the main Norfolk Naval Station is. And these graphics, courtesy of my friends at Climate Central, show roughly, and again, we've seen all the uncertainty estimates there in Stefan's talk, so of course there's uncertainty here, but roughly where we could expect to stabilize out on sea level rise for a given temperature. And we already are probably well in excess of 1 meter. Now that doesn't mean well in excess by the year 2100. Somehow the ice forgot to get the memo that it's supposed to stop melting in 2100. So this is more of a long-term stabilization or an equilibrium. And you can see that there's still a fair amount of land, and 2 meters, there would have to be a lot of infrastructure investment, but it's probably still viable. But what I show the Navy and the Department of Defense is that's what the land looks like, again, without, let's say, hard or soft infrastructure at 2 degrees, maybe 4 meters of sea level, give or take. And that's what it looks like if we just go to business as usual. We're no longer talking about the naval base at Norfolk because there is no naval base at Norfolk. Maybe it's at Yorktown, but it sure isn't on the Hampton Roads area because that's now we can steam destroyers over those piers. So the Navy talks to me about adapting, and they say, well, you know, we're raising the pier by a foot or so. And I kind of say, you know, dudes, you know, take a look at these maps. So there's 2 degrees. There's 1 degree. 2 degrees, 4 degrees. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 4 degrees. Those are the kinds of the scale of adaptation. Now, I'm phrasing this in terms of some specific bases on the United States. You could do this for pretty much any coastal city as well. Another risk that we're going to have, and that people are going to have to think through, is pretty much everybody at the same time is going to come to the conclusion that we need to do something. So it's going to be like for guys going to the barber shop on a Saturday morning where you get to take a number. And because everybody's going to be in line probably to the Congress because their local resources won't cover it to get this. And I tell the Navy and the Department of Defense, you may not get head of the line privileges in that line because there are millions of citizens that are also going to be wanting to have their coastal towns fortified. So that's just one place. For the U.S. Navy, we are a global Navy, and it's not just the U.S. bases. On the left is actually a picture of the island of Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is this little tiny island, British Indian Ocean territory, just south of the equator to the southwest of the Indian Ocean. I spent a week there one day. It's arguably, it is very strategic. I would say every U.S. military operation in Southwest Asia has in some way, shape, or form used Diego Garcia in the last 40 to 50 years. It's 1 to 2 meters above sea level right now. I've asked at in the Pentagon, the people who are responsible for this, it's like, can you tell me what the effective rate of sea level rise is on Diego Garcia? Nobody really could. I find that kind of stunning, given how strategic that base is. On the right is Kwajalein. The Air Force is building a space fence. That basically means we can track everything that's going on in space. It's a great idea. It's a wonderful thing for the Air Force to do. I applaud them. And they have a number of very expensive upward-looking radars as part of this space fence, roughly $1 billion. They put one, or planning to put one on Kwajalein, on the lower right there. 250-page environmental impact study. Guess what they didn't think about? Sea level rise. It's kind of funny until you realize that everybody here who is an American citizen is in fact paying for that and will have to replace it at about halfway through its life cycle because the sea level rise will make it non-functional. So those are just a couple of the ways in which the United States military, and frankly all militaries, are going to need to adapt. And again, in Q&A we can talk about some of the strategic implications, how places with already bad governance, like Syria, can become catastrophically worse. So that's really the third part. So what can we do? This is supposed to be about solutions, so I'll just go through a couple things here. First thing you do, it's kind of like a six-step program, right? First, you got to admit you have a problem. And to Secretary Mattis's credit, he did that. He did that at his confirmation hearing in something called Questions for the Record. He said that, yes, there is a risk from climate change to security. He's well aware of it. He gets paid to manage risks across the board for the Department of Defense, and this is one of them. That's quite a difference in policy, I would argue, from climate change is a hoax, which, of course, his boss has said. It's actually been, I think, very helpful that Secretary Mattis has said that. And what we've seen is that many of the efforts started in the previous administration, although maybe with much less fanfare and much less overtness, have in fact continued. And that's actually a good sign. And that's very smart because really this is an apolitical issue for the Department of Defense. This is risk management. This is not about politics, it's about risk management. You know, when we talk about these risks, and I think I see this in the Department of Defense as well as every place else, when we talk about 1 in 100-year risks, even people you think would know don't understand that if you're building a piece of infrastructure, that's actually about a risk of 40%, almost a coin flip. Even a 1 in 5,000-year risk is a 1 in 1% chance over, let's say, the lifetime of infrastructure. I don't know who or how we came up with this 1 in 100-year floodplain, 1 in 500. I wish we could change that. It is horrifically bad for overestimating the confidence or underestimating the risks of the things we have to face. Okay, let me just end on some good news here. So the gentleman here on the top left is a guy named Jim Langevin. He's a congressman from Rhode Island. This summer, Langevin, who sits on the House Armed Services Committee, actually introduced legislation in the National Defense Authorization Act that basically said, hey, Department of Defense, climate change is a big deal, and you need to tell us what's going on with it. We think it's a big deal. Now, this is the same House that, of course, a year ago passed in the same bill legislation that said there is no such thing as climate change, nothing to see here, and for God's sakes, don't spend any money on it. So this is a big change. It came to a vote in the full House, and the long story short is 46 Republicans voted for it, another 8 abstained. So you had over a quarter of the congressional Republican caucus not voting against climate change. Pardon for the double negative, but that's what it was. It goes to the Senate. It stays in the Senate. It goes through conference. It stays in conference. And I was told that as of 90 minutes ago, this is now law. President Trump signed this today. There was no signing language that basically singled this out, saying the administration isn't going to do it. So the fact is now we have the law of the land that climate change is a big deal for the Department of Defense, and they need to say to the Congress what's going on. This is tons better, folks, than having some executive order saying basically the same thing. This is now the law. Whenever anyone asks you in the Pentagon, why are we doing this? The very first answer, if you can give it to them, is it's the law. And now we don't have to like pretend and hide and do all these things. Okay, let me just close here with a couple quotes. This is from Admiral Nimitz. I don't think anybody would accuse Admiral Nimitz of being an overt tree hugger. But one of the things he said, and this is actually after Admiral Halsey ran a strike group through a typhoon, killed 700 sailors and sunk 3 ships, was nothing is more dangerous than for a seaman to be grudging and taking precautions. And I think if Admiral Halsey were around today, he would say something very similar about the risk of climate change. And as we've heard already in this session, and I'm sure we will hear more times, this is fundamentally risk management. And that's what the Department of Defense needs to do. So this gentleman here is alleged to have said, turns out he actually, Churchill never said anything, I think, but he's alleged to have said that Americans can always be counted upon to do the right thing after exhausting every other possibility. So we're still exhausting possibilities, but as I said, with some of the laws changing, there is in fact some hope that there is some light, and hopefully it's not a metro train at the end of the tunnel there. So with that, I will close, and thank you very much.
Time for a question.
Once, going twice. There's one. What is that law you mentioned? The law is the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018, and it was just signed this morning. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks again. Okay, well, continuing with our session, we are in fact going to hear about Mattis's boss in the next talk, which is entitled Navigating Climate Communication in Trump's America by Sarah Myhre. Sarah?
How do I toggle through the slides?
Just with the up and down button.
Okay. Hello, friends and colleagues. I'm very happy to be speaking with you today. I see my friends in the audience. I'm going to wave. So my talk is about navigating climate communication in Trump's America. I am not a communication scientist. I am a physical scientist. I'm a paleoceanographer, and I'm here speaking to you as a practitioner, someone who cares very deeply about how we do this work as a community, someone who has worked in the public eye for a long time, and trying to articulate how to do this work better as a community. So I'm going to describe my expertise so you understand the positionality that I'm going to speak from today. I'm a feminist, a writer, and a cultural critic. And I've written pieces this year about the culture of harassing and demeaning women scientists, treading the fine line between climate talk and alarmism, and my identity as a woman and a scientist and an activist. Stay close to my mic. I'm also a professional scientist. I'm a communicator, an educator, and a consultant. I'm a board member for an organization called the Center for Women in Democracy. And I'm a founding board member of 500 Women Scientists. And I am an influential woman. I'm one of Seattle's most influential people of 2017. And I'm going to be speaking to you today from that core, that nexus of all this overlapping expertise as myself. And I'm going to preface this by saying we're going to have some difficult conversations. This is not a regular science talk, folks. Things are going to get uncomfortable, and then we're going to get to a new place together. And so Luvi Ajayi, who is a speaker and a writer and says difficult things in public all the time, has 3 tenets for gatekeeping her speech in public, and I'm going to follow these 3 tenets. Do I mean it? Can I defend it? And can I say it with love? And so I intend to use that framework to speak today. And really, I think what solutions and this panel is about is leadership. And so this is a roadmap to leadership for us as a community. I'm going to talk about the normative spectrum of climate communication in the public, the landscape of discourse as it sits right now, the existential threats that are emergent for women, for scientists, for people of color, and intersectional feminism and human rights as the fundamental frame for the way that we interact inside of our community and the way that we act towards the public. Okay, so there is a spectrum of communication in climate change. It's a normative spectrum. So a normative spectrum is a spectrum of how things ought to be done. It's a subjective spectrum. And what we see in the spectrum is that on one side, there's the people that are directly involved in advocation. And then on the other side of the spectrum, people that are more directly involved in what we would call broader impacts, which is defined by the National Science Foundation as broadening scientific infrastructure and broadening educational infrastructure. So people fall based on their normative ideas about how we ought to be doing this in public somewhere on that spectrum. And each of those sides of the spectrum have real concerns. The advocacy side of the spectrum is very concerned about the imperative of stewarding public interests and the risks that the public face in front of us. Whereas those of us that speak in public that more align with the broader impacts are very concerned with the erosion of trust and credibility in the public and the maintenance of us as a community as trusted brokers of information. So both of those concerns are deeply valid, right? And the great thing about science is that you get to find yourself on that spectrum, and we all get to participate because of how broad and open our community is. Now, if you're an individual scientist and you have knowledge from your expertise, you have goals, you know what you want to say, you have skills because you've gone to tons of communication training, and you know where you fall on that normative spectrum, when you go out into the public and participate in the landscape of public discourse, you may not actually have the reaction that you were hoping to have, because the landscape of public discourse is not even. It is actually a deeply problematic, toxic landscape right now. And the things that are characterized in the landscape outside of science in the US are misogyny, white supremacy, racism, and bigotry. When we have the President of the United States referring to some good Nazis, or some good, good people on both sides in reference to the Charlottesville demonstrations, we have a cultural problem. So those things are happening at the same time as science denialism, as anti-evidence and anti-climate discourse in the public. More than one thing can happen at once. So the climate science skills that we see institutionalized and repeated around us are, around skills like tell a story, be personable, reduce jargon, know your audience, right? We've all heard these tenets. And yet I want to read some actual statements made by the administration and by appointees to reflect on the landscape versus the skills that we bring in the public. I believe in clean air, immaculate air, but I don't believe in climate change. President Donald Trump. I'm not a scientist, but in my personal capacity, I have many questions that remain unanswered by current climate policy. Harnett White, the White House environmental advisor that's just recently been appointed. I think that measuring with precision human activity on the climate is something very challenging to do, and there's tremendous disagreement about the degree of impact, so no, I would not agree that CO2 is a primary contributor to the global warming that we see. Scott Pruitt is the EPA administrator. So I want to ask you, how would the skills that we institutionalize with climate communication ever be sufficient in a communicative environment like this? They are not. They are insufficient, and they're in fact rudderless because they leave us as scientists bereft of the actual skills that we need to navigate public discourse. So let's deep dive for a second, because like I said, there are more than one thing happening at the same time. Okay, and please excuse me for the crudeness of this, but I think it's important to make this point. So this is an excerpt from the infamous Trump tapes. President Trump says, yeah, that's her with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Let that sink in. Billy Bush says, whatever you want. And Donald Trump says, grab him by the pussy. You can do anything. This is really a profound level of misogyny demonstrated by this public leader. I don't think it's hard to convince this room that climate change is an existential threat. It's easy to talk to scientists about the need to use basic information to make decisions and protect the public. But I want to argue here in front of you and my colleagues and my friends that for women, misogyny is also an existential threat. Misogyny systematically punishes us as women using violence, harassment, denigration, and dismissal. And misogyny degrades our public power and our cultural power and our public voices. So you might say, why does this matter for climate communication? Because we want every scientist to be able to participate in public discourse and succeed in communicating their succeed in communicating their message. And when women and people of color are communicating their science in public, they are not being received in the same way as our white male colleagues. The landscape is not level. And we have seen that very clearly with the current Me Too movement, and that was a movement started by a woman named Tarana Burke, where women across disciplines in our culture are coming forward and saying, I too have paid a cost because of misogyny and sexism in my personal and professional lives. It is a ubiquitous experience for women, professionally and personally, to pay a cost. So now I want to argue for all of you that integrating social justice and human rights into climate communication is a very effective paradigm for us to move forward as a community. And remember, women's rights actually are human rights. So we fall under that big umbrella. So reproductive rights, women's rights, the rights of people that don't look like me and sound like me. Human rights it's a big, broad umbrella. The first reason, it demonstrates public leadership. And this is why, because many of us scientists in public are saying, the people in the future, right, we're concerned about infrastructure, we're concerned about costs, we're concerned about suffering in the future for people. And many of us are saying those things whilst we look away from the suffering of people that are living right now in this world today. And we together need to advocate both for the lives of people in the future and the lives of people that are living right now. To do so demonstrates integrity and it demonstrates humanity in public. It builds empathic skills. Considering the experiences of your colleagues and your neighbors is critical. And it supports the scientific community because indeed scientists are a diverse and unique community. We are not homogenous. We are very different from each other, and we need those differences to be supported so that we ourselves are a healthy community. But science isn't political, right? It's not political. It's just science. Well, again, excuse this for the level of crudity, but it reminds me of a statement from my favorite public feminist, Lindy West. Abortion, feminism, online harassment, social justice. Women's no's are constantly doubted and eroded in our culture. Saying no and sticking to it, especially doing it where other women can see, is a political statement. And indeed, I would like you all to think about how being a woman and a scientist is itself a political statement because we live in a world defined by misogyny and white supremacy. I want to remind you that our community of scientists, I love this community. I have been a scientist for 17 years. I am deeply devoted to it. And of course, we are nested inside of society. And there is a relationship between these two things. And I don't think it's hard to argue that we export into the society scientific leadership and decision-making. I think it's also important for us to export cultural leadership. And what that comes from is how we treat ourselves, how we treat our colleagues, and how we hold our institutions to ever higher standards. And what I would argue with you is that what science needs right now is we need some feedback from society. We need to listen to what society is saying, and we need the voices of women and people of color inside of science to be louder and more prominent. I also think that we need to use the frame of intersectional feminism as the fundamental frame to evaluate how our science impacts people and cultures. You know, I put this diagram up there about my identity, my positionality, to introduce you guys to the idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality is an idea that was put forward by a scholar named Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. And here's a way to think about it. We as scientists are a galaxy of expertise, right? We're geophysicists, we're paleoceanographers, we're microbiologists. Think of the institutions that we're actually from, all the breadth of expertise and uniqueness, the kinds of gifts that we bring. The same is true for our identities, our racial and gender identities that underlie the people of science. We also are galaxies. And that's what intersectionality is about. It's about seeing us as nested inside of very complex webs, and every human being actually has a right to sit in the position that they find themselves in. So here are my recommendations, leadership recommendations. Institutions. Support scientists who speak about climate change and social justice together. Evaluate your scientific communication programs and staffing through the lens of equity and justice. Senior scientists, take responsibility for your privilege. You know, as a white woman, I get how uncomfortable it is to live in a racist world and to come to terms with my unearned privilege. So I am doing this work too. I'm not on some high moral precipice looking down at everyone else. This is the work that I do as well, and I am on the path of learning. So this is about us together as a community moving forward. Senior scientists, commit to a professional path that includes equity and justice. Junior scientists, dissent is intellectual leadership, so you can lead from where you are. My communication recommendations: institutions, stop teaching climate communication as if the field of discourse is level. It's not. The field of discourse is a meritocracy. It's not. And teach climate communication and social justice together. Senior scientists, stand up for human rights in a public way. Junior scientists, be prepared to stand up for yourself in a public way and protect yourself. Thank you very much.
Time for a question or two. Yeah, we've got time for a question or two. I can't imagine there are any questions. Please, yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And they seem to be the only way that we make brands sometimes. I don't know how to talk about climate change through a lens of intersectional feminism. I know how to do it through surfing. I'm a surfer. How do I make that leap? And do you think those methodologies for storytelling are a problem, or just that they need a different theoretical lens behind them?
I don't think that they're a problem. I think that they're a really useful framework, but when the stories are not, when we are not aware that our science is actually in service of the entire planet, right? We are powerful people as scientists, and the work that we're doing is not just for people that look like us and sound like us, it's for the diverse array of cultures and people that need to be served by physical science, by medical science. So it's the broadening of the platform of who are we talking to and why do we need to tell those stories. And then I do think the real piece is that there are stories that we're missing, right? We're missing stories from women and people of color in this community. We're missing stories not about what my opinion is, but what do I care about? You know, I just read this beautiful quote about, you know, our opinions are not going to change the world, but maybe our love for the world actually will change the world. So I think, you know, this is part about leading as women and being wholehearted in public and saying the work that we're doing is necessary and important, and we do it because we care very deeply. But we could talk about that after too. Thanks again. Thank you.
Okay, our next talk will be given by Irena Creed, and it is entitled Reimagining Energy in the North, Developing Solutions for Improving Renewable Energy Security in Northern Communities. Please.
Thank you, Sarah, for such a provocative talk. It gives us a lot to think about, and I think I might be bold enough to suggest that some of the threads that you talk about are relevant to the talk that I want to give today, but thank you so much. Today I want to speak about what's happening, some of the late-breaking developments in Canada. And we have a very strong female leader in climate change, Dr. Catherine Pauvin from McGill University. And under her leadership as a UNESCO Chair for Dialogues on Sustainability, she led over 90 academics from across the country to come together at a time when our country, we were very concerned about our political leadership, and we wanted to raise ambitions of Canada's policy on climate change. The outcome of this effort is a report called Acting on Climate Change Solutions from Canadian Scholars. And the overwhelming outcome of this consensus of this report was that Canada needs to make a shift from an oil-producing country to a renewable energy leader. And furthermore, this plan has to be for all Canadians, not just the average Canadian. Now, there are 10 high-level policy considerations that came from this report, and the first one was that we need to put a price on carbon. Secondly, we need to adopt an energy policy with energy efficiency and cooperation in electrification at its core. We need to make aggressive goals for low-carbon electricity production and climate action plans. We need to integrate the oil and gas production sector in climate policies, adopt low-carbon transportation strategies. And the next 6 start with supporting the evolution of the building sector towards becoming carbon neutral, safeguarding the environment, because as you move from high carbon to low carbon towards renewables, there are still things in the environment, especially with biodiversity and some of the water resources that are at risk. So we need to be sure to safeguard the environment. We need to support some of the resource sectors, including fisheries, forestry, and agriculture, to limit greenhouse gas emissions and also enhance carbon sequestration. Number 9 is to integrate planning policies at multiple scales, as well, finally, 10, to implement a more participatory and open governance institution. So we're very fortunate in Canada, and you can see here the wonderful potential for renewable energy that we have. You can see it in the wind in the coastal areas with the bright green, in the center of the country with the bright orange for solar energy, and scattered throughout that are existing and potential dams that can provide hydroelectric power. And so after preparing this position paper of scholars who were basically tired of the lack of action from the federal leadership, and by the way, that was before Trudeau came into office, for those who are fans of Trudeau. We then were posed by the current government to say, can you take it a step further? Can you look at coming up with recommendations that Canada can start re-energizing itself through pathways to a low-carbon future? And so what came out of this step, this Re-Energizing Canada, which was just released earlier this year, were 4 major recommendations. The first one is that we have to understand the transition context. And so we all know that decarbonization is not going to be easy, and that transforming the way we produce and consume energy is possible, but again, it's not going to be easy. In Canada, 73% of our energy supply comes from fossil fuels. I was tempted but decided not to show you the pictures of the oil sands and the devastation to some parts of our country related to that oil and gas industry. Now, previously, we've undergone energy transitions, for example, going from coal to oil to gas. But those were all relatively easy transitions because we had immediate benefits. It was less costly to have those energy supplies. But this energy transition is going to be driven by long-term risks of climate change and the volatility of energy markets that are motivating the development of these more energy-secure, renewable energy sources. So I want to show you just the state of Canada and taking stock of our current policy landscape with respect to climate change. And this diagram that you see on the bottom goes from 1990 up to 2050. We didn't make our Kyoto Protocol commitments. Many others didn't, but we were far below that. But with the Paris Agreement, we've put a pathway forward for a very aggressive reduction in carbon. At the federal level, by 2018, we wanted to see a 17% reduction. By 2030, this was to escalate to 30%, and then by 2050, 80% reduction. Now, what I want to show you on those yellow bars are where the provinces and the territories have put their commitments to see if it actually coincides with the federal. And as you can see, by 2030, they do coincide, but we fall far short by 2050. And if the map, I know that you can't see the details there, but I want to really highlight in these areas, the province of Saskatchewan. I moved there 3 months ago, and they have made no commitments to climate change, either in the short or the long term. And when you look at the north, they either have only short-term commitments or no commitments at all. So these are huge parts of our country where we can look to see, is it possible that if they start developing commitments, we can achieve that minus 80%. The second recommendation was that we need to recognize that there are many different pathways to a low-carbon future. Now, experts anticipate that our transition will be shaped around reducing demand. It cannot just be about the supply. We have to reduce the demand through energy conservation and efficiency. But we also can eliminate the high carbon fuels, replacing them with lower carbon fuels. And again, we need to increase electrification by switching to low carbon emitting sources of electricity. But we're going to need to be flexible, and as this diagram on the right shows a spectrum of different colors, we can take a whole multitude of different pathways to get there. The third one, and this one I'm excited to share with you because I think this is not just a made in Canada solution, but could be a global solution, and it's that we need to learn by doing to accelerate the decarbonization. On this diagram on the left, we show that we're presently in the stage in Canada of preparing a pathway for a series of transition experiments or models of successful and sometimes failing experiments where we transition from high to low carbon. And as we implement these transition experiments, we're going to learn through that process and take the successes, and that will enable us to go through a deep decarbonization. We've identified some principles that we want some of these transition experiments to follow. And you can imagine this being very decentralized. And the first one is that we have to have a shared vision for every community-based transition experiment. We need to identify what the optimal renewable energy pathway would be for that community, for example. We have to optimize the political pathway to gain support for that transition model. We need to design technological innovation so the potential can be realized, but we also now need to start thinking about social innovations, including market designs and how to empower communities to benefit as they transition. We also need to recreate some policy instruments to implement both the technological and social innovations. And we have to then do this as an iterative feedback. We have to always monitor to see if our vision is being met, and if not, how can we further improve it? 4 areas for transition experiments we identified were cities, the transportation, industry, and indigenous communities. And in this figure here, which is a photo of, it's basically a visualization of what a potential retrofit could be of a high carbon city in Burnaby, BC, is the photo that's in the bottom right. And you can see how planting trees and with the natural air conditioning effect and all these other things can be adopted so that we can switch to renewable energies, and even as populations increase, we can still move towards a lower carbon future. Now here is where I was resonated with what Sarah's comments were, that we need to integrate social and environmental justice in the low carbon transition. As we transition and meet these important targets, we need to ask the question, is there a risk that we will further disadvantage some of the marginalized communities in our countries? In particular, in Canada, we're a very large country, and here I've mapped out the circumpolar north, everything above 50 degrees latitude. There's not a lot of people living there in Canada. Many of them live off the power grid, and so they're at risk. And when we look at this, they're not large emitters of greenhouse gases, and they often use diesel, and because it's cheap, it's flexible, they can store it. So the question is, why should they too have to change? And the reason is because it's not about what their contribution is to CO2 in the global context, but they are also ones that are at high risk of the consequences of climate change. We talk about climigration. Should we stay or should we go? This region is going to be faced with reduced ice cover, degrading permafrost, rising sea levels, and increased coastal erosion, reduced reliability of ice roads, and also ecosystem shifts and species shifts that are going to affect their food supplies. Now, I have this map here generated by the Canadian government, and it's basically computing a community well-being index. And on the histogram on the right, the bar chart, you can see in the dark green are where all the non-Aboriginal people in the distribution is. And you can see a significant shift to the left for those that are First Nation and Inuit communities. And some of the ones that are really low in terms of that well-being index are, again, where I now live in Saskatchewan, the Northern Prairie provinces, as well as some in the high north. When we look at some of the conditions in which they live, you can see some of the housing inside. You have the diesel, which sometimes when the roads are starting to go, they're not going to have energy supply. There's definitely a link between energy insecurity and food and water risks. In many of the Indigenous communities in Canada, they have boil water advisories. They can't drink the water unless it's boiled. They have very expensive food. And so the question is, they contribute among the least to climate change, but they're among the most vulnerable to climate change. And in Canada, with the Truth and Reconciliation, which basically means that we have to come to terms with our past and our relationship with the Indigenous peoples, and we want to work towards establishing a respectful and healthy relationship with them moving forward, one has to ask the question, is this an opportunity? Can the energy transition to a low-carbon future be one of the greatest pathways for reconciliation with these Indigenous communities? So we seek, the collective of us, based at the University of Saskatchewan, but others across the country, to reimagine energy security for circumpolar north communities by creating and designing social and technological innovations for renewable energy systems that will enhance the livelihoods of the people living there. By accelerating this transition to low carbon in the circumpolar north, we can bring energy security, which will also alleviate some of the food and water risks. We can empower the communities. They can become autonomous, as well as self-determine their futures. We can generate sustainable wealth. And here in the photo, you could see some of the First Nations Power Authority based in Saskatchewan as a real powerhouse, excuse the pun, in terms of moving forward. We have spin-off opportunities in creating other jobs related to energy, become part of a community where successes and failures can be shared, and finally, we can also become global leaders in transferring some of these models across to other parts of the world where marginalized communities exist. But we have challenges to overcome. And again, I think it was the first speaker who talked about the high degree of variation amongst the communities, and that a one-size-fits-all solution is not going to be possible. And so we have to be adaptive and think about every context. We need to come up with governance structures to facilitate a very distributed energy system. We need money, financial capital to invest in the Indigenous projects. We need to share data from those that are wealthy and have the experience and have success models to others in the circumpolar north. And we need to develop training and technological skills for the communities that will take on this leadership. And so here in Canada, we're building this consortium. You can see it's not just within Canada, but the whole circumpolar north, and some of the groups that have come together are listed there. And if anyone's interested in joining and learning more about this consortium, you can contact us at renewournorth@gmail.com. We'd be happy to share that with you. I just have one final slide just to say we're excited in Canada, we're hopeful in Canada, we believe solutions are possible, and we need to, whenever anybody else is looking at these solutions, we need to understand the context, we need to embrace multiple different pathways, we need to learn by doing and share our experiences, and finally, we need to integrate the social and environmental justice in our transition. Thank you.
I think we might have time for a quick question. Time for a quick question. Stefan?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that we should treat the social injustice problem and climate problem together, and I fully agree, but you didn't mention that putting a price on carbon actually gives an opportunity to do that because the revenue can be used to solve a lot of social problems. And British Columbia, of course, has the experience with the carbon tax as one of the few places.
Actually, many of the provinces have started to move into that, whether it's the cap and trade or whether it's the carbon tax. So a lot of things have changed recently in Canada as we move towards that. Sadly, Saskatchewan is one of the only provinces that haven't made a lot of progress in that regard. But I think it's because they feel that there might be other solutions rather than putting a price on carbon, because they see themselves in the future being a major carbon sink with agriculture and things. So it's really interesting. But just to allow every different region to come up with their own way of dealing with the carbon and the revenue generation that could come from that is an example of how Canada's allowed these different pathways to occur.
Okay. Extra credit to anybody who can figure out how to lower the lights back down with that panel in the back. Thanks. We're on to our final talk before our panel session, Solutions for Avoiding Catastrophic Climate Change in This Century, given by Yangyang Su.
Okay. All right. Thank you, the convener, for the opportunity to speak. And I want to talk about a 1.5 degree target as ambitiously laid out in the Paris Agreement. And I want to address the question that how much more aggressive mitigation are needed to fulfill such a target and also avoid the catastrophic climate change within this century. And this was a close collaboration with Professor Ramanathan at UC San Diego. So much of my talk is based on the recent publication by Ramanathan and I, in which we lay out a 3-level approach to address the 1.5 degree warming target. And on the practical side, I want to refer you to a recent major report that provides the real-world solution to such a low warming target. Also, I want to argue that because of all those solutions bear on significant investment, at least upfront cost, so we need to do careful impact assessment to justify those ambitious targets and quantify the benefit associated with the lower warming. And lastly, I want to comment on Professor Ramanathan's interaction with Vatican and in pushing the climate change issue with religious leaders. Okay, so this serves as a background. I assume many of you have seen this already. In Paris Agreement, not only an ambitious target of well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees is set, more importantly is individual nations made pledge to future emission of carbon CO2 emission. So it's encouraging because this is the first time that all the nations agree on some numbers after 2 decades of talks. But at the same time, it's a bit discouraging because beyond 2030, nothing is being proposed. So it's a huge uncertainty beyond that. And if we simply implement those emission scenarios into carbon cycle model, we can clearly see Paris Agreement by itself is a major step forward compared with previous baseline scenarios, such as the RCP 8.5, which is widely assessed. Paris Agreement, just using the pledge up to 2030, will limit the growth of CO2 concentration under 600 ppm, that's 200 ppm under the RCP 8.5. But if we convert this into end-of-century warming projection, we can clearly see the red line is under the current pledge of Paris Agreement that give you a central warming of 4 degrees. That's clearly beyond the 2 degree target. And what's more concerning is the probability distribution of this curve that has a fatter tail toward the right, meaning with the central estimate of 4 degrees, there's really a small but non-negligible probability that the warming can be as large as 6 or even more degrees. So that's the that's one major message here. So in order to push the curve towards the left in reaching the green curve here with a central value of 1.5 degrees, we're really buying us more insurance that we will have a lower warming in the future. But even with the central warming of 1.5, there will be a small chance that warming will exceed 2 or even 3 degrees. So with the target in mind, we can work the simple climate model backward to see what's the emission pathway are needed to fulfill such a target. And again, the red line is the current pledge made in the Paris Agreement, which quickly go off the chart. And in order to stabilize the warming under 1.5 degrees, there are essentially 2 potential pathways. One is with the early peaking time of carbon emission, just 3 years from now, as Dr. Rahmstorf mentioned. In that case, there will be no overshoot of temperature, meaning the temperature is stabilized throughout the century. Or in other case, that the carbon emission peaking time is delayed by 10 years, we can still achieve the 1.5 degree target, but that has to be associated with massive carbon capture down the road. So those 2 pathways are, we can also quantitatively show those pathways here. On the left, again, is with early peaking time of 2020. Peaking at 2020 is not enough. It has to be followed by a steep slope of decarbonization and reaching a 0 emission at the mid-century. On the right-hand side is another scenario in which the CO2 peaking time is delayed. And in this case, we not only need to reach carbon neutrality at the middle of the century, we have to go to the negative emission, meaning carbon capture at a very large scale. And in either case, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will clearly have a downturn. So we will know successful or not. We will have measurements to suggest which is the case. So just summarize our commentary piece that there's a wide emission gap for reaching the 1.5 degree target, despite the current pledge made in the Paris Agreement. This is also echoed by many assessment reports since 2 years ago. And we lay out a 3-level approach to this problem. The first is a deep decarbonization of the economy, and the second one is to scale up the capacity of capturing CO2 from the air. And the third one, which is actually receiving more progress nowadays, is to cutting non-CO2 species. So those are just the theoretical calculations. On the practical side, this is a recent report published early this year, led by Ramanathan Molina and Dervu Zalki, involving multidisciplinary participants. Dr. Titley is also involved in this study, in which we, I don't have time for details, but I want to read you the bullet point here, that in the case of 3-level approach, we suggest that we have to decarbonize the global economy system with improved energy efficiency and increased use of renewable energy. And the second level is the one that receives more rapid progress these days, is to cut short-lived climate pollutants such as methane, ozone, black carbon, and HFC. And on the top is the carbon capture approach, which is more technological challenging by enhancing the land sink of CO2, such as afforestation and the soil restoration, but also the direct capture of CO2 and store it in geological reservoir. On the foundation of this is the political framework. And again, not going into details, we propose we need to scale up subnational governance. That's the action plans at the city level and state level. And we also suggest we need to strengthen the existing agreement, such as extending Paris Agreement pledge in the Paris Agreement beyond 2030 and also enhance other sister agreements. And one prominent success is the Kigali Amendment to Montreal Protocol last year that include hydrofluorocarbon as a regulated species. And I also want to comment that in addition to searching for solutions to mitigate climate change, we need to assess the climate change impacts just as an information source for planning for adaptation in the future. And I will give you two recent examples of such efforts. The first one is led by Dr. Brian O'Neill at NCAR National Center for Atmospheric Research, in which we compare two sets of global climate model simulations under RCP 8.5 and 4.5 to assess the benefit of reducing anthropogenic climate change. And we can see we assess commonly used meteorological quantities such as heat extremes, heavy rainfalls, global drought, and there is a clear separation of many metrics here, suggesting there will be a benefit to mitigate climate change. We also look at things beyond physical climate system to include crop yield, human mortality to heat stress, and also the area affected by dengue vectors as disease transmitting agents. So the bottom line is there is a clear benefit of going with the RCP 4.5 mitigation scenario that will limit the 21st century warming under 3 degrees. So how about the 1.5 and the 2 degree warming target, which is clearly more difficult to achieve? So we also recently concluded 2 sets of simulations specifically designed to stabilize the climate model simulation under those 2 levels. And in the case of 1.5 degree, again, there are 2 scenarios. One is a never shoot scenario. Another is with overshoot of temperature, then falling back to the 1.5 degree. And in either case, some negative emissions are needed at the second half of this century. And with this set of simulation, we can do a lot of impact assessment, such as looking at future sea level rise toward the end of the century. This is with sea level rise as high as 1 meter. This is using the empirical model that Ramsdorff proposed years ago. And since it's a global climate model, we can also look at regional phenomena such as Arctic sea ice loss. In this case, we quantify the probability that the Arctic goes sea ice free in the future. So under 2 degree scenario, there will be a 30% of chance that the Arctic sea ice will be completely lost. And in the case of 1.5 degree, the risk is lower to below 5%. Okay, so lastly but not least, I want to brief you the interaction of Professor Ramanathan with Pontifical Academy of Sciences. I'm not personally involved in this effort, but I'm happy to be the messenger today. And one prominent recent success is a workshop hosted in Vatican involving a large audience, including health experts, economists, social scientists, as well as climate scientists. And they all conclude that climate change indeed is an existential threat. So that's a bigger word than catastrophic. And I'm glad Sarah actually used the word in her talk. And the final declaration from this workshop was endorsed by many Nobel Prize laureates, plus Dr. Hawking, and as well as political leaders from developing nations, and also Governor Jerry Brown. And more importantly, religious groups leaders are also involved in this discussion. And clearly, one thing that they care most is the impact on human health. So lastly, I just want to conclude my presentation by reading you the preface by Pope Francis. I think it's so beautifully written as a preface to the declaration. So, O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes, bringing healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may see beauty, not pollution and destruction. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, time for a question in the back here.
Yeah, I guess all the scenarios we developed is more or less physically constrained, that we work out a scenario that will meet the CO2 concentration and radiative forcing that is needed for stabilizing the climate.
The question, though, is whether the economic analysis supports that. Economic cost-benefit analysis supports those 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius targets.
For the two studies I cited, we haven't done carefully integrated assessment modeling work beyond the emission scenarios. But I understand your point that the storyline behind those emission scenarios might be very challenging. All right, thank you.
Right, well, thanks very much. We've had a really wide-ranging set of presentations, and fortunately, we've got another 35 minutes or so for our panel discussion, and that's going to be led by my Penn State colleague, Richard Alley. And can the speakers all come on stage and occupy the seats here?
All right. So a fantastic set of talks. While the speakers are coming up, I'm Richard Alley. I'm an old geologist who studies ice, which keeps melting, and I got a pretty good bicycle. And if you're interested, we're doing the open mic tonight at 7:30 up at B.B. King. So if you want to see a really different way of doing communications about geophysics, come on up for the AGO open mic tonight. But we're going to do serious stuff here. The plan, as you probably have figured out, is that we're going to take all these people and line them up with too few microphones so they can't see each other, and then they're going to have a discussion. So, and what the plan, I think, is going to be is we will first briefly open it to sort of let them interact on issues that they raised that were of interest to the others. We're going to save lots of time to come out for you in the audience to raise questions and discussions. But we'll start, were there any issues that any of you raised that the others wished to comment on? Stefan, go.
Yeah, I would like to comment on the emission scenarios. Calling a scenario that plans 80% reduction by 2050 very aggressive, I think, is a wrong term. I would call it inadequate, especially given, and the same for Germany. Germany has a target of 80 to 95% reduction by 2050. This will not satisfy the Paris Agreement, especially if we consider that the wealthy industrialized nations, I think, will have to reduce more, faster than the developing nations, which need a certain amount of carbon space for development. And they certainly are of the opinion that the historic emissions legacy that the wealthy nations have already left in the atmosphere should at least partially count into the budget. So we can't, in the industrial nations, keep planning with inadequate targets like that, which implicitly assume that the developing nations are going to do more.
I totally agree with your comment.
Get close to it, yeah.
Is it on? I totally agree with your observation. I suggested it was aggressive relative to our historical performance. If you could see the Kyoto Protocol, our failure to meet that, and now, is that better?
Yeah.
And it's aggressive relative to past experience. It's completely inadequate, I totally agree with that, but it was aggressive relative to our past experience. And if you could see that all the provinces and territories combined together are still not, it's not in the works that we're even going to achieve the -80, those of us who care about climate change are desperately concerned about that, not even meeting the -80%.
And if I may just make a tiny technical point, you showed a diagram showing the share of primary energy. That is always very unfair to the renewables, because of course in a coal station you need at least twice as much primary energy to produce the same electricity as a wind turbine or a photovoltaics device does. So if you're advocating climate solutions and renewables, you should never show a share of primary energy diagram, in my view.
Other issues among the panelists before we open it to the floor?
Since we're on this page, I want to comment, actually ask the question that what's the...
Yeah, speak into it more closely than you think you should. Put your mouth right next to it and it works.
Yeah, I want to comment on this and also ask the question about what the reality of reaching the peaking time of CO2. And people have been a bit optimistic in the past few years, given the fact that the emission has been stabilized for the last 2 or 3 years. But then the recent report came out that this year there's an uptick of the emission by 2 to 3%. So whether or not we can reach the target of 2020 emission peaking is now again in question. So maybe you can say more about this. What's your opinion of reaching the emission target and when?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I'm not a prophet. But I think it's for sure that we will not reach this peaking unless governments actually take much more decisive action. I think it's not going to be happening by itself. There is so good indications that if you do put a price on carbon, then you can actually turn around this very quickly, like Great Britain has put a minimum price on CO2 emissions, and their emissions are now back to a 19th century level, actually, because they basically got rid of coal very quickly. If you put at least $30 per ton of CO2 emission price on, then it just becomes unviable to run more coal power stations.
It often comes up. Okay, so we're going to turn it around to the group here. You recognize the challenge here, that solutions is almost everything. AGU is looking for ways forward. How does AGU catalyze the fantastic opportunities? Because looking down this road, the policies and the inventions and the businesses and all the other things that can help the environment can also help the economy. They can help ethics, they can help national security, and they can help employment. And AGU is very clearly recognizing the good that can be done and the power in the scientific community here, the engineering community, to do this. But how do you catalyze something this big? And so we'll open it up and Alan will start us.
So I've been to AGU Chapman conferences on climate communication. As Sarah said, I know how to talk to the public, but there's this very well-funded group that pays congressmen to vote to keep coal and oil alive, and they say, we'll challenge you in the primary and you'll lose if you don't vote for us. And coupled with a disinformation campaign to the public, how do you fight that? No matter how well we communicate to ourselves, to the public, how do you fight back against that? We don't have the same resources.
I'm not the expert on this, but talk is cheap,
So my answer plus $2.04 gets you a small cup of coffee at Starbucks. But don't call it small, because then you'll be in an argument with a barista for 15 minutes. They don't sell small. Okay. I think a number of things, and so I mentioned this Langevin amendment, this amendment that passed the House. Basically, this is a very conservative U.S. House of Representatives. We got 46 Republicans to vote for it, another 8 to abstain. They're all under the influence of the people you talked about, but they also all know, all of these people, they actually do know who their boss is, and they do know that the boss is ultimately the voters. But if the voters don't care about an issue, then it's very easy for these special interests to come in. If climate change, even Richard, I think, showed this morning some slides that showed a majority of people, yes, kind of get that climate change is happening and it's kind of a deal. But if it ranks out as number 15 on the top 10 list of things that you care about, so what? There's very little political damage or risk of accounting for that. But as it moves up, then it starts influencing votes. So I'm on an advisory board for something called the Center for Climate and Security. We actually did an analysis of who were those 46 Republicans. And it turns out the correlation with, did they have a military base in their district? Not really. Were they on or were they on the coast? I thought it was going to be the coastal guys. No. It was how purple was their district, and specifically how purple was their district with respect to climate change. So I think one of the things we've seen, if you look at the longitudinal study, the George Mason, 6 Americas, we were doing fairly okay, 07, 08, and then we had ClimateGate, right? And irrespective, and there's people in here who can talk much more about it than I can, right, Mike? But what happened is, I would say we lost a decade. We're now, when you look at the 6 Americas, we're at or slightly above where we had been. We dropped like a cliff on the public. And again, for all the wrong reasons, but we're back above that now. So how do we, I tell people when enough people care enough in the public, this is why I subject myself to the tender mercies of United Airlines. It's when enough people care enough, not just on the coast, but in many districts, that we can start to get these swing votes. And we don't need everybody, but we need enough to get, whether it's 60 sometimes in the Senate or sometimes just 51, and it's always just a majority in the House, to get legislation through. So I think it's ultimately going to be driven by the public, but I think it's going to be the public is going to have to care enough. And that's where us as scientists or as social advocates or whatever, different people, I can talk to the military. Sarah will talk to a different set of people. All of us probably have a constituency or a shtick or a story. Catherine Hayhoe, of course, comes to mind. All of us have different audiences and constituencies we can reach. Nobody's going to do it all by themselves, but it's kind of like an orchestra, probably without a conductor even. But collectively, I think that can help move the public. The facts on the ground, like big hurricanes, sea level rise, also help move the public. And that will say, this puts it up there. And that will get across to the political leadership. They will not lead, but they can be led. And that's what I think is going to happen. Thanks.
I want to respond to this as well. I completely agree that this is about a tide of public opinion. And as more people experience the impacts of climate change in how they vacation, how they heat their house, how expensive their food is, what's happening to their dad's farm, that's how we build a grassroots collective movement where people say, yeah, this does involve me. This has to do with my family and how we spend time and how we're gonna be able to pay rent this month. And the problem is in the public spaces, we're having these constant arguments of attribution. Did the hurricane season, was it amplified by climate warming? Was the low snow year of 2015 a fixture of climate warming? As an earth scientist, I don't care. Because when we use, I do care, it's interesting, we want to answer those questions, but fundamentally, what we know about the carbon system and the things that change when we modify and disturb the carbon system, the consequences to ocean circulation, oxygenation in the deep sea, ocean acidification, the distribution of polar environments, sea ice, mountain ice, all of those consequences are also a component of climate warming. And I think we do a disservice when we focus on weather events and warming rather than reframing this as a planetary phenomenon that we have very, very robust information about. So the arguments constantly in the media about attribution are poisonous to the public's view of climate change.
Okay, thank you. Gavin had one, and then we're going to come over here on the other side, so we're not going to let everybody in the middle control things, but go.
Some of the relatively aggressive proposals that are coming out obviously require large and potentially contentious issues that cross a whole set of different values. That if you're just looking at it through a climate lens, the answer, the solution seems simple, but then when you conflate it with all of the other issues that are going on, it becomes very complicated. I mean, and there's people on the panel here that could probably address this, like the carbon tax proposal in Washington State, Site C in British Columbia, Deep Wind in Massachusetts. All of these things, two of them have gone down, one of them may go down. If you looked at them from a climate view, it would be clear which way you would have chosen. But when you actually get down on the ground, the conflating issues of justice and access and the environment become much, much more complicated, right? So how do you, I mean, we can't avoid that because these are big changes. So how do we deal with that?
Okay, so just before you answer, those of you in the back, could you hear the question? No, okay. So we do have a problem here. Questions have to be short, they have to be loud, okay? And I'm sorry, but because we don't have microphones to carry around to you, and I apologize for that. So the question was, I believe, paraphrasing, that climate change is embedded in a much bigger suite of issues. We could categorize solutions based on their ability to solve climate change rather easily, but it's much more difficult to deal with the whole thing. How do we deal with that from the wisdom of our panel? And I just gave you all a chance to choose who was first while I repeated that. So, Stefan, do you want to try first?
Well, maybe I can comment on one aspect, which I presume Gavin meant, that is a conflict between climate solutions and other environmental concerns like bird protection, because that is quite an issue in Germany with the wind turbines. We have a lot of wind energy built up now, and actually the environmental movement is quite in conflict over this and split. We have some nature conservation organizations that are fighting against wind turbines, and they are being captured by right-wing parties now. Actually, we have this, for the first time, a right-wing party in the German Bundestag, which is outright climate denialist. We've never had that before. Welcome. And they...
Welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you thought it was positive that a quarter of the Republican caucus did not vote against the climate thing. I'm shocked that I'm shocked that 3/4 did. You know, it's yeah, I know. So yeah, this conflict exists, and that is politics. Really, is solving these conflicts of interest. And with wind energy, it's a question of siting. You know, which sites do you allow, which ones do you exclude? And we also have a massive problem now with the kind of disinformation campaign, like with climate denial. We have the renewable energy denial, where a lot of myths are propagated about actually how many birds are killed, and a lot of unsincere, dishonest arguments are being put forward, like people that have never complained about billions of birds flying into lit-up high-rise buildings at night or being eaten by cats, for example, but suddenly when a wind turbine kills birds, they become great bird lovers. That's a little bit dishonest, but you know, we just have to deal with this. And I think with the renewable energy skepticism, these people that work in renewable energies, they can probably learn from the experience from climate scientists how to deal with these disinformation campaigns that tell you, I don't know, the battery of a Tesla is worth 40,000 kilometers driving or something like that, wrong numbers that get circulated, just like wrong bird numbers. And it is not unheard of that birds of prey are found under a wind turbine. I just heard this story in Germany recently. And then they get taken to an institute to investigate the body of this bird of prey, and it turns out it was deep frozen before it was actually found under the wind turbine.
I don't have a good wind turbine bird story, but so I will use a reference to a leader of the women's movement in the U.S. to respond to this. So I was lucky enough to see Tamika Mallory at the National Women's Political Caucus give an hour-long talk. She was one of the leaders of the Women's March last January, and so she talked about intersectionality as a fundamental frame for authenticity in public. Many of us, let's not mince words here. The climate agenda is squarely on the left right now in terms of where we find the most support. I don't think it is a partisan issue, but unfortunately there's partisan and political realities that we just need to air and talk about. So climate change is a point issue on the left, as well as social justice, education, equity, racism, misogyny. On the left there is a galaxy of issues that are being brought forward. What Tamika Mallory said, which was startling to me and I learned a lot, was that if you are advocating for example, the cost of college, and you are not at the same time looking at the women adjacent to you that are advocating to stop the school to prison pipeline, your fight for education is inauthentic. And I think that there's real wisdom in that, because if we want to be authentic leaders in public, we need to look at how our issues touch all the issues around us and not just say, well, I want this one first. My issue comes first, the rest of you come next. And I definitely have had a lot of people in public say to me, once we figure out this climate change stuff, your equity and justice issues, we'll do that next. Imagine someone saying that to you when it's your life and your voice and your equity and your family and the bodies of your children on the line. It doesn't square well with people. It doesn't sound authentic. And so that's why intersectionality as a fundamental frame, it's harder, it takes more work, we have to do all the things at once, and people want to say, well, we don't have time for all the things. Well, actually, if I can walk around with a computer in my back pocket and talk to Hong Kong whenever I want to and order a pizza with my thumb, and it comes to my door, we can also actually do these other complex problems that require multiple moving parts.
All right. So somebody over here who's yes, please.
Hi. So it seems like something missing from the conversation, especially surrounding carbon tax, is how our relationship with other countries also affects carbon emissions. And so I'm talking about importation of goods, overall consumption, and that's not something that's really been factored into what we're talking about today. So how can we, in a global context, understand that it's not just our responsibility in our governments or institutions, but also social, political, economic institutions, of how in our country we can maybe prioritize importations from other places that emphasize similar things as we do, and how can we even begin to talk about something like that, which is so seemingly intangible right now.
All right. So the question, if you could not hear in the far side, is about the carbon that is evident in trade. So we can put a tax on our carbon or a price on our carbon, but then if we buy something from someone who does not have a price or vice versa, there is so carbon is moving across borders essentially through trade. How do we deal with that? Is that fair? Okay.
Yeah, Richard, I can.
Dave, yes.
I can take a quick shot at that. So full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board for something called Citizens Climate Lobby, which advocates for carbon fee and dividend. Don't call it a carbon tax with those guys. And this is actually, I mean, not to trivialize it, but this is actually pretty simple. You can put a border tax on. So you could tell, let's say we get all of our stuff like from China, maybe not quite all, but almost all. And you can either say, look, China, you can either have the same carbon tax we do, or at the port of LA Long Beach, I'm going to tax it and I'm going to keep the money. Which would you like? My guess is within about 6 hours of us putting a carbon fee on, Beijing would follow. And to the, yeah, I mean, you can do that. It's really, if we had the political will to put a carbon fee on US stuff, then we have the political will to put it on imports. So my guess is the other countries would very rapidly put it on themselves and do whatever it is they're going to do with the revenues, not let the Americans take it there. So I think we can figure out the trade piece relatively easily, but it's a huge conditional if. It's conditional upon us having the domestic will to in fact price carbon to begin with, which is not really happened yet.
Yeah. Yeah, in my experience, economists are very happy with the idea of internationally harmonized carbon taxes or prices. Way over in the corner, please. How do we make the discussion with social sciences more useful for us in moving forward, I believe was the question. And policy.
Well, maybe I can comment on that because I work in a multidisciplinary institute together with social scientists, including economists, and I think really that's the way to do it. You have to lock the natural scientists and the social scientists up together in one building and make them share the canteen and talk constantly, regularly, learn each other's jargon and ideas. I think really that's maybe not the only, but it's certainly the best way of doing it.
Okay.
I would say the same thing, Camille, with the University of Saskatchewan. Every name on that list is a social scientist. I'm actually one of the others who is a natural scientist. But I think the issue goes beyond just who's in the team. I think it goes to the point of what does it mean to be an academic when you have climate change? And I think that what we have to do, and much of what I spoke to, if you knew my background, I'm a hydrologist and biogeochemist, and here I'm talking about working with communities at risk. And I've been very much influenced by John Holdren's comment about scientific tithing, that each one of us needs to give back to the community. And I think that academic institutions need to start acknowledging that this is what academics should be doing in their merit systems and their performance evaluations. Because I think although government is one way to go, we can set models for the public by working with them in very much a participatory way and have these models of success that can scale up and take over, imagine them igniting a fire and taking over and being that kind of model rather than waiting for governments to take policies to change. So I think both the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, whichever term you want to use, we want to call it transformative science that we can work with communities to affect change.
Thank you. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just very quickly to build on that, you mentioned policy. So I'll just tell you very quickly kind of how I did this in the Pentagon. So you can imagine the Pentagon, again, not a whole bunch of, tree huggers running around in there, although 1/3 of the building does have uniforms that look like trees. And really what you put it in is, don't talk the language of science, talk their language, talk in terms of risk, talk in terms of things they care about. Usually it's some of the nearer term issues, and okay, I say like the Arctic opening up, and we know that's not this year, next year, but when you start looking at, let's say, acquisition time cycles to build a ship and get it out there and use it, that's 30 to 50 years. So you start bringing the future to the present, and it's going to be different for different sectors, but if you're talking infrastructure, if you're talking whatever, that a lot of things we do are 30, 50, 70 years in the future, so we need to bring that piece of climate into now to start trying to influence budget, and and be able to do that, and then be able to basically say, so here are some options, and these are kind of what they cost. Ultimately, it comes down to cost and what you would either trade-off or how you would dual use it. But it's not just a science presentation, but it's really talking to whatever decision maker in their language, not ours, of science, and bringing that future climate knowledge that we have, along with the risks and the uncertainties, into their decision space.
Okay. Yes, please.
Could you talk about what you envision a zero carbon emission world looking like in 2050? I mean, that just seems inconceivable.
Okay. So the question was, can you talk about what a zero carbon emission world in 2050 would look like? Yes.
Yeah, all the women are in charge. Yeah. Because you know it's going to be women that make these decisions down the line for their communities and for their families. Yeah. So with that, I will.
Right. Maybe Yangyang, do you want to pass it all the way down to the end there? And yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't use the word inconceivable. I think.
Get it close, really close.
Yeah, I think it's definitely conceivable with the growth of renewable energy and also the negative carbon emission. But it's a question of whether we can, whether it's feasible. But definitely we're getting there. Yeah.
Okay.
Just look at when I was visiting China a few months ago, I visited several campuses, and they are investing a lot of money in renewable energy and battery-powered vehicles, scooters, cars, and buses and trains. So they see this as an opportunity to grow the economy and bypass some technological barrier that traditional industry imposed on. So I think fueled by this profit growth, there will be more investment and growth in the renewable energy part. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any Stefan?
Well, of course, this could be a very long discussion because you have to go through the different sectors. But yeah, as he mentioned, the key, of course, is renewable energy. We will have a 100% renewable energy society then, and that means basically an electrified society because you will do a lot more things with electricity, which currently you are doing with fossil fuels, for example, transport. We will have completely electric vehicles. I think we will phase out the combustion engine in vehicles by 2030 or so for that. For house heating purposes, you can use a heat pump, for example, which is also needs a little bit of electricity, but otherwise uses environmental heat. And that, of course, already exists. And my friends around the corner in Potsdam have a passive house that uses zero energy for heating. And so I think mostly these solutions do exist. There are some sectors that are notoriously difficult, one of them being air traffic, for example, which is not readily electrified. And there are discussions about using biofuels for air traffic, and then you have to see how much land area do we actually have, how much in terms of biofuels can we supply. But there is detailed discussions available on that. For example, the German Advisory Council on Global Change, of which I was a member for 8 years, has published a book called The Great Transformation, where we basically go through all these different sectors, what is needed to come to a zero emission society, and a lot of it will be learning by doing. I don't think we have a complete blueprint of how we will do it, because we are entering uncharted territory there as well, and yeah, we will learn it as we go along. And I think as soon as it's clear that there's a lot of money to be made by finding solutions, then we will see a lot of ingenuity by our engineers.
Okay, so thank you. So we are almost at the end. Jim, our chair, is going to say a couple of words to close us off here. But first, I wish you would join me in thanking our panelists. This was a fantastic job here. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate it. The fact that we can't answer that last question very well is probably the reason why we need to work on climate solutions. I've got some pretty good ideas I think we could share. This is about so many things, and I really appreciate the things the panel said. Climate change is about human rights. Climate change is about human dignity. Climate change is about people who don't have what we privileged people have. So really, we do have to take this out to those people very much more in terms of empowering them, making them recognize how much because they're often not even aware when their home is gone that they've been hurt by climate change. So, I think we've got to get out into some different trenches than the trenches we've been working in. Now, again, before you stand up, could you please all just stay sitting for just one moment, and could the people that are on the committee that I named at the start stand up so you can all be seen for a minute, because what I'd like you to do is, if you have an idea, talk to one of these people or one of the panel members or to Richard, or send any one of us an email. Our emails are all over the website. Get that information to us so that we can interact with you. This group will be meeting tomorrow to do much more formulating on this. And actually, I want to recognize Sybil Zeitzens. Sybil is right there. Would you stand up as well? Because she's going to be on our committee. She is the director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And so she will be on our committee as well, and I appreciate her being here. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get busy on climate change and human rights, and I think we can really move this forward. And thank you to AGU for doing this. And thank you to everybody. And I didn't sleep at all last night, so thank you all for being here and making this look like it'll be a success.